Well, we welcome you to this seventh session of How the Bible Came to Be here at St. Thomas Episcopal Church. We're going to make a big transition today. One that probably will address a number of matters that you never really thought about. The actual construction of the text that we use for looking specifically at New Testament, but the idea is the same as well for Old Testament. I've got handouts, well, not handouts, but things to share, display models and so on. So if you're bored with what's going on, make sure you get your hands on one of these, and then you can spend the rest of the time leafing through something. Will the Lord be with you? Let us pray. God, at the end of his book, the writer of Ecclesiastes noted that of the making of many books, there is no end. The comment has often struck us as rather whimsical and even made us smile. But it occurs to us that in regard to the bookmaking craft, this is yet one more way in which you have accommodated yourself to us. As our appreciation of your word increases well our appreciation of all those unnamed men and women who dedicated their lives to be making sure that legible copies of your word were always available to read and study. And for those today who can't read or who choose not to read, may our lives themselves be open books that draw their attention to your grace. Amen. Well, okay. So we're going to look at manuscripts today. We've spent 3 weeks looking at Old Testament. We spent 3 weeks looking at New Testament, at the sort of context, the world in which those documents were, and then at the text itself, and then finally at the Apocrypha that gets attached to both Old and New. Today we're going to transition and look specifically at the manuscripts of the New Testament. How were they made? What did they look like? What did they contain? Etc. And there may be some interest in here for you, because from time to time people will say, can we really trust that our Bible is like it was when originally written? Hopefully by the time you get to the end of this class, you'll have an answer for that, whether the answer is yes or no. So, we're used to our Bibles looking something like this. And that's because there was this about 550 plus years ago, almost 600 years ago, that produced this, which just revolutionized everything. It was even more revolutionary than the transition from typewriter to computer. It was something along the lines of the transition from using a pen or pencil to using a typewriter. And those of you who are writers or do any kind of composing, you know that you compose very differently based on whether you're using a pen or pencil or if you were doing this. Words come out of your head, believe it or not, very, very differently. So it was a huge transition to finally have Gutenberg Press and have this kind of book being created. Before this, there was this in terms of New Testament manuscripts. It's all handwritten. And if you look real close, I'll come back to this a bit later, but if you look real close, you can see that there are some marginalia kinds of things over here. Somebody's written in the margin. And there's some little things up here too, in the margins. And if you look even real close, it's probably not large enough for you to see, but like right here, there's a little squiggle up above the line of text. This one is actually a very, very clean page. I could show you manuscript pages that it looks like something you were doing to your book in 7th grade, including the doodles of some guy smoking a cigarette or something in the margins that you most likely did. But anyway, here's what a New Testament manuscript looked like. This particular one is about mid-4th century. And before that, they looked like this. This is papyrus. Hadn't aged quite as well. In fact, most of the papyrus looks something like this. It's just a little scrap. Kind of like this, and I'll pass this around in a bit. When we talk about biblical manuscripts, it could be that we're talking about something that looks nice like that. But lots of biblical manuscripts look more like this, and the vast majority look like this. It took somebody a long time to even figure out that that was a biblical manuscript, as opposed to somebody's shopping list that just happened to survive. So, in a pre-printing press world, before Gutenberg, all books are hand copied. It takes time to produce one of those. In the same way that you might groan if you had to reproduce an encyclopedia article. Just think if you had to reproduce all of Shakespeare's corpus, you had to do it by hand. They don't like to do that. But just the simple fact of reproducing a book by hand introduces all kinds of things that you and I probably don't think about, or at least don't think about a whole lot unless we happen to be a teacher. Things like legibility of the script really matters. It may not matter to you if you're writing, but for the one who's reading, they sure do have some concern about whether it's legible. Or the size of the script. That doesn't just have to do with whether we have old eyeballs or young eyeballs, but just the simple fact that you got to be able to see it. So the script, and it makes a huge difference whether you start at the top of the page in big letters, and by the time you get to the bottom of the page or page 10, you've got little tiny letters. So some regularity in the size of the script as you go along. And so that introduces the whole idea of standardization, which isn't just the size of text, but also whether the guy's handwriting tends to do this, or if it stays like this, or even the kind of standardization that crosses regions or countries. It's one thing to read American script, if you're American. But if any of you have read, say, German script, their handwriting looks very different. They tended to write letters, not just that they wrote different letters. I mean, they were still Roman, but the way they produce their letters doesn't look like we produce our letters. And so it's really, really hard to read. Well, that's, if you're German and you're reading German script, that's fine, but if that book leaves Germany and goes to America, it suddenly becomes really hard. So one of the things that was done as these Bibles were being produced in the earlier days when it's all being done by hand, they standardized the script. So it didn't matter whether you were living in Bulgaria or Spain or Egypt, all the letters looked the same. They standardized the script. And that doesn't even get into the issues of things like, well, how durable is the material on which you're writing? The difference between papyrus and vellum. Or the weight of the material. A whole lot of papyrus sheets don't necessarily weigh a whole lot. But if you've got several hundred or several thousand sheets of vellum, it suddenly begins to be kind of heavy to carry around. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, if you've seen any, say, early books from the 1500s, most of these books are like 2 to 2.5 feet high and maybe a foot to a foot and a half. Coffee table books, and pretty thick, and they might weigh 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 pounds, and those are small ones. You can get into some that you just think you need to be Arnold Schwarzenegger to be able to carry around. And there's availability of material. If it's vellum, are there cows around? Are there goats around, antelope around that you can use? Is there enough papyrus to get your hands on? Is it, are we in a period where prices have stretched beyond what I have available to be able to purchase? So durability, availability, price, the expense that is involved. And because the price of materials was so high, you tended to fill the whole page up. Unlike we do today, where you want nice empty columns and you like lots of space between words. Even in our books that we produce today, that's the same way. We like lots and lots of white space. Well, that's because paper's cheap and plentiful. And so we can not worry about some things that people worried about when it cost a lot. I mean, I still have, at my house, which was my parents' house, I still have boxes of paper that would have just been thrown away from my dad's classrooms, from some of them date back into the late 50s and early 60s, that you didn't throw that stuff away because paper was kind of expensive. So paper that's blanked on both sides, I stick that in my copiers, my printers at home, and use that rather than going out and buying new paper. And one other matter on this before I leave it behind, we'll come back to this next week, but there's also the whole issue of inspiration. If you've thought about the inspiration of Scripture much, you probably would say, well, that's we're talking about God inspiring the writer, and that's certainly true. But inspiration doesn't stop there. Inspiration also extends to the copier of the first thing, the inspiring of that person to get it right. And not only the first copier, but maybe a transcriber, and then a translator, translating it from Hebrew to Greek, or from Greek to Latin, or from whatever to English, that they choose the right words, that they put it in a form that is then makes sense to the person who's going to read it. And it even extends, once you start on that, then you begin quickly to realize, well, that inspiration even extends to the reader, to us, to be able to read and understand whatever it is that the text says. And since some of us have had at least something to do with academics along the way, let's say that it even extends to the scholars somewhere along the way. I know that's hard to believe, but okay. So how many of these kinds of things exist? Let's start with non-biblical texts, because there's lots of books that were ancient that we still read, and I know you're not going to have the answer, but one of you who is brave, just blurt out something here. Homer, the Iliad. How many old manuscripts do you think there might be of Homer? Just blurt out a number. 2. 0. Anybody braver? 147.
Tiny fragments of lots of them.
Wow.
Something like 1,900 manuscripts. Most of those have actually been discovered just in the last generation. Most of those are the little scraps. I mean, we're not talking all of the Iliad that there are 1,900 copies of. It might be 6 or 7 letters or a couple of lines. That constitutes a manuscript. Okay? Homer lived in 9th century BC. The oldest Homeric manuscripts of the Iliad are 4th century. There's a 500-year gap. So one could raise the question, well, how close to being accurate are they after 500 years of being copied? You know, the old thing about whisper a secret into the ear here, and what's it look like or sound like by the time it gets to the end? How accurate is it after 500 years? Did any of you read Livy when you were learning Latin in school?
I
No.
don't think so.
I didn't learn Latin in school. Livy's primary book that matters for us still today is his History of Rome. He's a rough contemporary of Augustus Caesar. Tiberius Caesar dies 17 BC, 18 BC. Something less than 500 of his manuscripts still survive. And there's a 400-year gap between the time of his death and the earliest manuscript. Julius Caesar, you at least know that guy. His Gallic Wars, 251 copies.
Where are these?
Some are in monasteries, some are in universities, some are in museums. You know, if you get your hands on one, it'd be kind of neat to have.
Yeah.
So a lot of these actually end up being purchased by Dennis, who's a collector, and he gets one, you know, and then at his demise, Creta says, well, I don't know what to do with this thing, and she gives it to a museum. Julius Caesar dies 43-ish BC. There's 1,000 years that elapse between what he wrote and the earliest manuscript that still exists. 1,000 years. Or Plato. His dialogues, there are only 238 manuscripts of Plato that we know of that still exist. That's pretty amazing. Of Aristotle, it's like 50 that still survive. Or Shakespeare, you know, early 1600s, there's not a single one. Now there's a reason for that with Shakespeare. It very quickly transfers over to being printed, published. So there's not a great need for a manuscript. But for those people who are Shakespearean scholars who want to delve into things about Shakespeare, well, doggone it, it'd sure be nice to have something that he wrote to be able, did he really use that word? When we get 2 weeks from now, no, 3 weeks from now, when we get to the point when we are looking at the King James Bible, somebody remind me Shakespeare. And I will tell, if I don't already do it, if I'm looking like I'm leaving King James Bible behind, somebody stand up and scream Shakespeare, and I will tell you a story about the importance of being able to see in a manuscript what Shakespeare wrote. All right, let's move over to New Testament manuscripts. There are two primary kinds of New Testament manuscripts. The first are those that are made of papyrus. Papyri is the plural of papyrus. If you don't know, papyrus looks kind of like rhubarb on steroids. It gets really tall. They might be 6 foot tall stalks. Rhubarb, of course, doesn't have the little pom-pom frond at the top, but nevertheless, it's, you know, that really stalky kind of grass. And so to get from that to making papyrus that looks like paper, you'd chop it off at the bottom, get rid of the pom-pom, and then you'd start slicing the stalks. Not like this. You do this on it to get whatever size of sheet of paper you want. You want it to be 12-inch pieces of paper or 6-inch pieces of paper. That's what you would do the crosswise on. But stalks, you would just cut those long. So and then once you had those cut into strips, then you'd cut them off to whatever size you wanted. Follow me on that?
How wide are those, then, once you split them? I mean,
Well,
an inch or something?
well, it depends on how big the stalk is.
Yeah.
But somewhere in 3/4 of an inch.
But they showed us in class that they would crisscross the strips to make those sheets.
Yeah, exactly, like this.
Yeah.
So once you've cut all that stalk into long strips, you can't get it too thin, but cut it into strips, and you'd lay them all right beside each other, slightly overlapped. Did any of you build log cabins with popsicle sticks? Same kind of idea here. And then once you've created your first level mat, then, as Elena said, then you would turn it perpendicular and you'd lay it all the way across the whole thing again. If you're in Egypt, you could just use some Nile, which apparently Nile water is almost the consistency of glue. You don't want to drink it, I think, but it does wonderful to gluing papyrus to itself. Anywhere else, you got to use a little bit of glue. But you fill that entire first mat up with the second level, and then you could begin writing. Now, have any of you tried to write across corduroy? Yeah, or popsicle. You want to write with the popsicle stick, with the corduroy pants. You don't want to write across it. So for the most part, this isn't entirely true, but for the most part, papyrus is one-sided. You want to write with this, and you could get, depending on how large your letters are, you could get 2 to 3 lines of text across that before you would then go to the next one. You, for the most part, didn't want to write this way because your pen would just jump and it wouldn't look good. When you fill that page up, which could be any, say 6 by 12 or 8 by 9 or whatever it was, you laid it aside and then you wrote on the next one. And when you get your term paper finished, then you start gluing each one of those pages onto the next page. Like this, you can kind of see, here's a glue strip, here's a glue strip, there's a glue strip.
What did they write with? Like what ink?
They made their own ink.
Oh.
Could be lots and lots of different things. It could be roots that give off, walnut, for instance, not that they used walnut trees, but walnut produces a really dark ink. Certain.
Because our ink fades. I mean,
It absolutely fades, and that's very faded. And it's nothing you can, our ink fades, so it's just the way it is.
There are different ones that last different lengths of time. They learn which ones would, first of all, write on the medium, second of all, be readable after a time.
Yeah, there are manuscripts that somebody has gone back to later and copied over the top of it to be able to redarken the text. And different things make different colors of text. Same things that dye clothes, red or purple or whatever, could also be used as a medium to use on a text, dipping a reed into it to be able to write with.
When they talk about colors like carbon black, that's what it is. Burnt umber is burnt umber. That's really what it is.
That's exactly right. Once you got your text completely pasted together, In the time period of scrolls, you would then put a stick on the front and a stick on the back, glue it to your text, and then roll it up. The rolling up, once we get to the Latin language, one would say that it has been volumed. It has been rolled up. And that's where we get our word volume. So somebody who writes a long book, it might be a 2 or 3 volume work. Well, that's what they called it 1,000 years ago, so that's what we call it still to this day. Long books are composed of volumes. There will come a point in time when, because this is cumbersome, it's hard to do, and you know, since you can only write on one side, well, that's kind of expensive because you're wasting half your material effectively. There's a transition to what becomes known as a codex. Codex is the early word for a book. Well, books you can write on both sides. And whether they are made of papyrus or whether they are made of vellum, that compacts everything. There's just all kinds of reasons to move from a scroll to a codex to a stacked book. That's papyrus that is in preparation to be a codex. Actually, this was a codex. It's disintegration from a codex. It's come apart. Still to this day, books are composed or made of sheets of paper that have been folded. And today, as was then, they're not just folded once. This one is, but most of them were folded then another time. And that fold like that produces what's known as a quire or a signature. It's not true today because things have been mechanized, but in older books, you will notice at probably the bottom of page 16, and then at the bottom of page 32, and then at the bottom of page 48, because this produces signatures of 16 pages, you will notice either a number or a letter at the bottom, like that. You see that little letter? There are privileges for sitting up close. You see the letter? Here's the next one.
It's like an eye exam.
That's not the point of showing you this.
That's where the bundles were sewn into the.
That's a little siglum that actually matters. Books before today, let's go back 75 years, 100, 150 years, you've created those signatures. Well, then you've got to put the signatures together. So at the bottom of each signature is a letter or a number in either chronological or alphabetical order, so that the next temp who's got to do this work knows the order in which they're to be put together. So B is supposed to follow A, C is supposed to follow B as you put these, and so the books still show that.
The librarian said that that was how books were still being manufactured. That would show us that you had a lot of books were stitched in. The papers would be stitched there into the binding. And they said what they did is they assembled them like that. Then you have folds at the edge so you can't read the pages, and they had to come and trim the edges so that you could turn all the pages.
That is very true, but you can't see it today. That's exactly right. So I've got old books to show you what was once done. Okay, to get back to the New Testament manuscripts. 1900. The ecclesiastical world knew about 9 papyrus manuscripts. That's all we had. 9 that we knew could survive. But that's about the point in time when there's this huge push to try to locate old manuscripts. So by the time you get to, say, 1960-ish, the ecclesiastical and university worlds, museums, they knew about 75 early New Testament papyrus manuscripts. Today, they know about 155 that have been cataloged and are available for people to look at. Now, a papyrus manuscript may look, wherever that framed thing is at this point, it may look just something like that. That is a papyrus manuscript. And know what is in that little frame is just a facsimile, of course. It's nothing real. Or it might look like this. Or it might look something more like that. We have 155 of those that we know about that have been cataloged today. Okay, so let's move on to parchment or vellum. If you don't know, we're talking about cowhide, or a goat, or antelope, or any other kind of animal that might be plentiful and available. And you'd have to treat, cut the hide to whatever size you want, and then treat it with pumice and other things, lined to be able to get it to a point where it is supple enough to be able to really use and be able to last. And of course, the other side's got hair on it, so you got to get the hair off that side and beat it down a whole lot more to be able to produce. And then somebody's got to think about, if you're reading one side that's probably darker and one side that's lighter, you kind of want to put dark to dark and light to light, because your eyes, it's kind of messing with you if you're going back and forth. There's all kinds of things to think about there. But you got to start with the fact that you got to have a plentiful supply of either cows or goats or antelopes or whatever to be able to butcher, so that you can have sheets of paper to be able to use. The wonderful thing about vellum is that you could write on both sides, as opposed to just writing on one side. So it streamlined a whole lot of things that you had to deal with. 155 papyrus manuscripts, there are almost 3,300 vellum manuscripts, parchment manuscripts that we know about today that are available. And there's 2 primary kinds of writing that occurs on vellum manuscripts. The first, they're called uncials. In the same way that probably when you first learned to write, you had those lined sheets, and you were taught how to do this, as apparently kids today are not taught how to do this because they can't write with a flip. But we were taught how to do that, and we probably wrote in capital letters. An uncial is a capital letter. And the reason we were handed those sheets that had the black lines, the blue dotted lines, or at least dashed lines, was so that you learned to write the same size. An uncial is not just a capital letter. An uncial is the space that occupies 1/12 of a column. Think newspapers, column of text. An uncial was, you could fit 12 uncial letters on one column. Standardized text, just like that lined paper taught us to do when we were in kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade. 12 letters to a line. of a column. 1750, there were 23 uncial manuscripts that we knew about. 1900, there were 161. Today, there are 338 that we know about. The oldest is this. This was in a military encampment, 250. So these started out pretty early. You mentioned one other thing, not that this matters to you a whole lot, but these papyrus manuscripts, the way that we distinguish between them, you see that? I hope I didn't turn myself off.
It's making a curve.
That P designates papyrus.
Oh.
It's the 50, this particular little frame thing that you've seen, that's known as papyrus manuscript number 52. Papyrus manuscript 90, etc. In uncials, you don't have the P in front. You just have a 4-digit number. This is uncial manuscript number 0212. Or here's one, 0220. This one contains part of Romans. And then there are some that really are neat and nice, like Codex Sinaiticus, written in the 330s, pretty complete. There's a couple pages missing at the front in Genesis, and there's a couple pages missing in Revelation, but for all intents and purposes, it is a complete manuscript. And if you wonder, well, why are the pages missing in the front and pages missing in the back, think about some of the books that you've had. That you end up losing a page or two here or there. Same reasons. Or another one that's very similar. This one was found at a monastery at the foot of what's thought to be Mount Sinai. So it's Sinaiticus. This one, I bet you can't figure out where it's at. It's at the Vatican Library. So it's Codex Vaticanus. There's Codex Alexandrinus in Alexandria, Egypt. And the other big one of the 4 big codices, the other one is known as Ephremi Rescriptus. Ephremi is Dennis's name. It's a name of the person who owned it, as opposed to the place where it was stored at. 12 characters to a line is not many. So the next step was to move beyond uncials to minuscules, little letters. Minuscules are not just small letters in addition to capital letters, but it's also a kind of cursive script. Well, cursive you can put a whole lot more in than printed characters. So that's what they moved to eventually as well. The earliest minuscule is about the year 820. But you can see that's little letters compared to what was up there before. This is some margin writing that has taken place here. So this is much less expensive, and simply because it's much later, there's a whole lot more of these. For every uncial that still exists today, there's probably at least 10 minuscules. So a bunch of these that we have. Starts about the time of when Charlemagne was Holy Roman Emperor. When the King James Bible was produced, based on primarily Erasmus's work, he was working with 7 manuscripts, 7 biblical manuscripts, to produce what ultimately becomes, not because of Erasmus, but 100 years later, the King James Bible, 7 manuscripts they used. Today, we have something like 6,000 manuscripts. So if you ever wonder, well, why have we kind of moved beyond the King James Bible? It's not just because of the these and thous. It's also because we've got 1,000 times more manuscripts to be able to consult, to know for sure what the text really said is available to us. So you add all those up, that's a whole bunch of manuscripts that we have available today. But there's more than just papyrus manuscripts and parchment manuscripts. There are lectionaries. The church didn't just start chopping up the gospel into little pieces that you read on a Sunday morning in the last few years. It's done that as long as there's been a church. The Jews did that with the Old Testament before there was a church. And one of the clearest examples of that is in Luke 4, when Jesus stands up in his hometown synagogue in Nazareth and he turns to today's lesson, which just happened to be the one that was used yesterday at Jim's funeral, Isaiah 61, and he reads that. Church, being Jewish, takes that over. So those lessons, the official title is a pericope, were then bound together. So you don't necessarily need a whole Bible if you are a priest who's just going to read a little piece on a Sunday morning. So in the same way that we have a pulpit, we don't really have a pulpit Bible. What is it even called? A pulpit lectionary? What
what we have at the lectern?
Yes.
It's just the Revised Common Lectionary.
Okay, so we have a pulpit lectionary. We don't even have a pulpit Bible. Pulpit Bibles are huge. You can get rid of all that other stuff we don't read anymore, and just each of the little gospel sections are printed, one after the next, after the next, after the next. You think, well, that's not good enough. Manuscript ought to be the whole Bible. Well, you see what constitutes a manuscript. It might just be a little scrap of paper to begin with. So to have a full section of a gospel text is actually pretty good. And some of these old lectionaries go back to 4th century, 3rd century, collections of these things. So to have those neat collections of large portions of Scripture, it's a manuscript in and of itself that you can consult to know about a Scripture text.
There is a giant Bible on the bottom shelf of the pulpit.
Okay, we've got one stashed away, like every church does.
It's
You
right
know?
behind it, there.
Those things, when they got used, they start falling apart. And what do you do with a Bible that's fallen apart? Well, you don't just throw it in the trash. So you've got a back room somewhere and you start stashing that stuff. Every monastery has a back shelf, a back room. Every synagogue, every Jewish temple has got a back room. You just stash all your stuff there. And that's where some of the greatest finds have occurred over the centuries. Certainly in the 20th century, is that finally that Jewish synagogue allows scholars to come in and start looking at their stash of old stuff. Or the monastery, the same way. And so these things come back to light. And thank goodness they didn't just get rid of them. Because, especially if we are down in Egypt, all those old papyrus manuscripts, not just biblical ones, but other ones as well, what do you think that they wrapped the mummies in? What do you think wrapped up the mummies to transport them to America when places like the Chicago Museum and other, or collector dentist wants a mummy in his house, many dentists in the 19th century did, they'd order a mummy. Well, to stick it in a box and send it over to, you got to fill in all the holes. So all these old papyrus manuscripts were just wadded up and stuffed in there like your styrofoam peanuts. And then when it arrives, Dennis goes, I got my mummy. He pulls out his mummy and he throws all the other stuff in the fire. Well, at some point, some dentist was as interested in the paper wrappings around the mummy as he was the mummy, and went, hey, this is Romans chapter 4. I want to keep this. And so people began ransacking the places that were selling the mummies because they had manuscripts that they were using. And still other monasteries, it got cold. And so page by page of old manuscript, they'd rip out and use it as kindling to start the fire in their furnace. In addition to lectionaries, early translations. Old Latin is what Latin is referred to prior to the Latin Vulgate Bible. Well, there are about 96 old Latin manuscripts that are available. And there are even pieces of broken pottery that might have a verse or two written on it. This, incidentally, is not broken pottery. This is pottery. Not pottery. This is clay, and this is actually cuneiform. And it's full size, and you'll notice if you take a look, there are 5 columns on this little thing, written in cuneiform. But that's outside of what we're looking at, because we're looking at New Testament today. So there's 25 known pieces of ostraka, or potsherds, that have the New Testament written on them. There's even a couple of amulet charms that have some biblical text written on them. I think there's 6 or 7 of those. Put it all together, almost 6,100 manuscripts today. Every year there's 20, 25 more manuscripts that are discovered, which doesn't mean they find them buried somewhere. It may mean that on a shelf somewhere among this huge box of little scrap pieces of manuscript, one finally gets pulled out and somebody's looking at it and they go, oh wow, this is Mark chapter 2. So every year there's 20, 25 more of those that are found. Right now there's more than 6,000. When we were kids, there was something in the neighborhood of 2,000. And our parents or grandparents, there was somewhere just in the few hundreds. And if we go back 1900, we're talking way less than 1,000 available. So it's been this mushrooming effect that has occurred, thankfully, during the 20th century and into the 21st, that has allowed us to have so many more of these available. And if we were to include, in terms of manuscripts, translations into Latin, because Latin kind of rules the day, from the Latin Vulgate on, all the way up to the Gutenberg Bibles, there's more than 25,000 manuscripts that are available. You just have to realize, now this is a translation. It's not Greek anymore, it's Latin, and that's only as good as Forrest the translator was in terms of turning it into Latin. So it may or may not be real good, but if we include those, we've got 25,000 manuscripts to work with. Think back now to Homer and Julius Caesar and all those others, and consider those who say, well, I don't know if we can trust the Bible to be accurate. We've got 25,000 manuscripts to work with. Those non-biblical writers, 200, 300 is all they have. And these go all the way back to within even 100 years even 50 years of the originals versus 500 or 1,000 years before we have a manuscript. Okay, chapters and verses. You may find it hard to find things in the Bible as it is, but imagine if there weren't chapters and verses. Those divisions that we take so much for granted. The Bible didn't have chapter divisions until about the 4th century. By the 4th century, you're beginning to have them. They don't look like our chapter divisions today. They look more like pericope divisions. Reading just Isaiah 61, 1 through 3, or Luke chapter 4, verses 14 through 21, or 14 to 19. That would be a chapter. Nice, quick, easy to locate divisions in the text. Now, it may be that Forrest reads better than I do. So his chapter divisions, instead of having, say, 60 divisions of Mark, Forrest may only have 22 divisions of Mark. He reads more. Whereas Ken, he doesn't read so much, so he's got 230 divisions of Mark. Chapter divisions don't get standardized until, well up almost into the Middle Ages, to what we have today, where every single version of Matthew just has 28 chapters. It's divided in the same place everywhere. And verses don't come along until about 1250 because of this particular guy who shows up at the cathedral in Canterbury. The story is that he divided up the Bible on horseback, and that's why sometimes it doesn't make a lick of sense where that verse division is, because, you know, that's a fable. That is not true. It could be true, but the story about that regarding Stephen is he would divide the text on his journeys, is what it says. So how literal do you want to take that? Does it mean he's sitting on the horse doing this, or he's got him in his pouch so that when he stops for the night, he can pull them out to work on? Both of those mean on the journey. If you like the story, he's on his horse, and that's your explanation for why some verses show up the way they do. Okay, so we've got the originals, we've got even copies of them. We've got to make more copies. So the monks hang out in writing chambers, scriptoriums. You see them sitting at their little desks. In the early days, they didn't do that. He's got his in his lap. And if you really can't tell that for sure, here's a blow-up. Or here's an early Egyptian version. We might read that way, but can you imagine writing that way? Well, there's all kinds of things we could talk about here. If you are a scribe writing, are you looking at a text and copying, or are you listening to somebody read the text and writing? A lot of it was done by somebody reading the text and you writing, which is fine unless you've got somebody who doesn't pronounce his words right or puts the wrong emphasis on the incorrect syllable. You know, then you've got some issues that you've got to deal with. Or, I mean, my grandpa loved to go fishing. And that's how I learned to go fishing with him, but Grandpa didn't like to stay fishing in the same place. So he'd go way down, see where the fish were biting, and this one particular time we were fishing, he realized he needed the tackle box, and we forgot to bring it, so he said to go back and get the tackle box. Well, where's it at, Grandma? It's on the tar. And so I go back to the truck, which by this point is about a half mile away, to find the tackle box. I can't find any tar in the back of his pickup to save my life. And I can't go back to Grandpa saying I can't find it. So I'm looking, you know, the bed of the pickup's only so big, I can't find any tar anywhere. Finally, Grandpa is tired of my, you know, his incompetent grandson, and he comes back to see what on earth is keeping me, and he walks to the bed of the pickup and he picks up his tackle box and walks back to the fishing hole and leaves me standing there. Well, the tackle box was on top of the tire. I grew up in Kansas City where we knew how to talk. We didn't have tar. Imagine if you're having to write what the person is saying to you. Never mind that there is this thing in any language. It's true of American as it is of Greek. All vowels start sounding like the letter E or I, short E, short I. Every vowel starts sounding that way. Some people don't cross a creek, they cross a creek. And on along those lines. There's all kinds of errors that then begin to show up because somebody is not paying attention. Or noises start getting made. Or the monks in the next room over are doing who knows what. Or somebody knocks their ink well off the desk. Or outside, there's some animal making a lot of noise. And you don't hear correctly. But you can't fall behind, so you got to write something there. So it's possible that errors can get stuck in along those lines. Today it would be, you know, phones or earbuds or airplanes or equipment backing up with that incessant beep, 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 beep occurring. And never mind things like homonyms. You remember those from school? Is Jesus' return imminent? Or is it imminent? Or is it imminent? It's very different depending on which one you write. Or, do we have a betting scandal occurring in Springdale, or do we have a betting scandal occurring in Springdale? Or are we talking about somebody's sense, 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 or are we talking about somebody's sense? And on and on and on. They all sound the same. What's the word that's being used? Hopefully context helps, but I gotta write something. Stick it in the document. Punctuation doesn't show up in text until 9th century, 8th, 9th century. Until then, letters just get plastered right next to the next one. There's no space between words. Paper's too valuable for that. So every word is just a continuous thing. And if you get to the end of the column and you're in the middle of a word, you don't hyphenate or save that word to put on the next line. You just stop it wherever it is, go to the next line, and keep right on going. So somebody has to come along behind who actually knows the language to know where the breaks need to occur. It does eventually come a point where they start putting in spaces between words, where they'll put a comma or a period to offer you pauses, or a question mark to offer you pauses. But those aren't in original manuscripts anywhere. There are even contractions that will begin to happen. And I said that one of those documents in there had some contractions. You can't contract everything. Contracting stuff that nobody knows what your contraction means is pointless. So you've got to have regular words that you might contract, like God or Jesus. Those are your contractions. Well, all right, I'll get back to some of this in a couple of weeks when we get to, say, early Bibles, the Latin Vulgate or the King James, and address some of that along those lines. Next week when we come together, we've been talking about stuff that kind of begins and ends with us. The creation of manuscripts or the reading or writing of text. But we're going to step back next week and reintroduce God into a bunch of this. And we're going to talk about things like inspiration and canon and revelation and authority. What does all that mean, and how does it play into biblical manuscripts? And once we've done that, then we'll take the last portion of our class, weeks 9, 10, 11, and 12, and start talking about Bible translations, starting with the beginning, but then moving up to where we are today. Is the New Revised Standard Version the best Bible to read? Or is it the New International Version? Or the Message Bible? How do you compare and contrast those? What should we be trying to read today? So that's where we're going to end up over these next several weeks. So we'll be thinking about the Bible next week. Thanks for being here.